of the things that I'm super passionate about and a lot of what my research focuses on, which is culturally responsive STEM education. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. If you'd like to tweet or connect with me on Twitter, at Victoria the Tech is my Twitter handle, so you're more than welcome to utilize that. But other than that, we're going to go ahead and jump in. So a little bit of information just about myself, that way you know who I am. I am a proud product of New Jersey K through 12 public education. So I spent my entire, K through 12 educational career in New Jersey. I grew up in Marlton, which is a suburb of Philadelphia, but on the New Jersey side. I currently live in the Seattle area, partially due to my wife's job. She's a member of the Air Force, and we're at the Seattle base here, but we love it, so we're going to stay. I did my undergrad at the College of Charleston, which is in Charleston, South Carolina. And I did my graduate degree through Western Governors University, and my graduate degree is in curriculum and instruction. I'm a former high school math educator, but my current role is quite long. It's a STEM integration transformation coach. So I work with schools to lift up their STEM profile. I also work with them to ensure that they're using project-based learning as a vehicle for equity. I evaluate teachers, so it's a lot of fun, and it's all focused on that STEM element. And then last but not least, most of my research focuses on culturally responsive math education, as well as STEM education, math pathways, and then also just leveraging technology in the classroom. And before I begin, is this being recorded, or should I go ahead and press record?
Thanks for asking. This session is being recorded.
Okay, great. Awesome. Yeah,
thank you.
I just figured I'd ask just in case. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and get to it. What is culturally responsive STEM education? And it does a couple of things, and it also is quite a few things. So culturally responsive STEM education is science, technology, engineering, and math curriculum and instruction that does all of the following. First and foremost, it decolonizes curriculum and instructional practices that are harmful to students of color, non-neurotypical students, and also students who do not necessarily fit the status quo. We're going to talk a little bit about the decolonization in a little bit, but specifically we're making sure that our curriculum is pro-Black, pro-brown, pro-non-neurotypical, making sure that every student is included in this space. This doesn't necessarily take away from the students that are already included, but it makes it an entirely inclusive curriculum for everybody involved. Second, what it does, it directly addresses and dismantles what we call white supremacy culture, which we'll talk about culture and white supremacy culture in a few moments, and also individualist thought. These are things that inherently are not only bad to education, but are especially damaging within STEM. So we want to make sure that we are not, talking about that. Also, it empowers students with hands-on instruction, inquiry-based learning, and project design opportunities. This makes the entire experience not only inclusive, but authentic for learners. And that's the goal. We want to make sure that our students are learning authentically. And we also want to make sure that with what we're doing with our instruction, they're pretty much like the purveyors of their education at that point. It's not a set and get. They are totally agents of their own education. It also provides realistic insight and opportunity for students to pursue STEM in K-12 education and beyond. It encourages students to become critical thinkers regardless of the discipline that they're in. The skills that they learn in STEM, they can take with them anywhere. And it also has them foster what we call soft skills, right, in the real world authentically. So that is what culturally responsive STEM education is. And with that being said, we'll go ahead and take a look at exactly just debunking what all of this means, because sometimes it can be a bit tricky, and I want to make sure that I set the scene that way if we have questions we can address them later. So I talked about white supremacy culture, I talked about STEM. I'd be remiss if I didn't at least touch on what culture is. So this is from dismantlingracism.org. If anybody's interested, I have the link below, and I have no problem dropping it in the chat box later. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful resource for anybody, starting in their anti-racism journey, or they're just kind of figuring out how to have a positive classroom climate. But if we're talking about culture and just exactly what it is, the definition of culture in layman's terms is that it's the knowledge that is shared by a group of people. That's pretty basic. When we actually dive deeper, culture refers to the knowledge, it's the experience, it's the beliefs, it's the values, it's the attitudes, it's the meanings, it's the hierarchies, it's the religions, it's the notions of time, it's the spatial relations, it's the concepts of universe, it's the objects and possessions that are acquired by a group of people in the course of generations through individual and group striving. So there are lots of different ways that we can interpret culture, but when I'm going to be talking about culture specifically, it's going to reference the culture that we've cultivated as educators and also in education. Another quote that you can see off to the picture to the right is that culture is something that unites people. So as educators, I feel like what unites us is our love of learning. What also unites us is our love of making sure that children succeed. And I feel like that almost always really has positive intent, but sometimes that positive intent doesn't necessarily line up with making sure that all of our students are feeling included. And this is especially true in STEM. So if culture is something that unites people and culture is the knowledge that is shared by a group of people, now we're going to veer a little bit differently and talk about white supremacy culture. And typically when I give this session, there are folks that are either unfamiliar or uncomfortable with me using the term white supremacy. This is not my specific term or my specific choice of language. Again, this comes just directly from Dismantling Racism. Highly, highly, highly recommend that you check out that resource. It is absolutely wonderful for anybody beginning in this journey or anybody that wants to view their instruction or their career through an anti-racist lens. So I am superimposing that into what I'm saying today. So if we take a look at what white supremacy culture is, at its base, white supremacy culture is reproduced by all of the institutions of our society. I am an educator, I'm a STEM coach. My wife is in the Air Force, okay? If I take a look at education, 80% of teachers are white women. I, as a Black woman, I'm a minority in that. I'm not necessarily saying that 80% of teachers being white women is white supremacy, but as a Black person, I am a minority in a sea of white women. The same way that my wife, as a member of the Air Force, is the minority in a sea of white men. These are just facts. So it's reproduced by all of the institutions in our society. Now, in particular, the media, the education system, and Western science, in particular, just reinforcing the idea that race as a biological truth, with white race being the ideal top of the hierarchy. Again, these are just facts. In history classes, eugenics is taught. They specifically decided to take away reproductive rights and also legitimate rights of folks that were not white and wealthy. At the same time, slavery. I don't even think I need to go into more detail there, but there's definitely a racial hierarchy that persists in the United States that we have to recognize as educators, because this plays a central role in what we do. And it also plays a central role in reproducing the idea of white supremacy. And again, if you're uncomfortable with that term, it's not necessarily targeting you, it's talking about the culture as a whole. And we're going to talk about what those traits look like in just a few moments. Now, trademarks of white supremacy culture at its core, that white is normal, white is better, white is smarter. I put all of these in air quotes because they're not necessarily true, right? We're all at its core and at our core, we're able to be as best as we can be and as smart as we can be. However, there are inherent systems that are in place that systemically gatekeep Black, brown, pretty much anybody that isn't white from being in spaces that allow for them to succeed. So in contrast to Black and other communities and people of color, there's definitely an inherent power balance there. And in education specifically, this manifests itself in many ways, particularly with things such as academic tracking and pathways. It is not a mistake that most gifted programs are for white middle-class children. And there has been much research on this, and I do not mind dropping links, later on. That way, if you'd like to do research, you're more than welcome to. Things like discipline. African-American boys and girls are suspended and disciplined at a rate anywhere between 3 to 5 times more than their white and Asian counterparts. Things like curriculum. As a Black person and as a Black student myself, I was taught that my history began at slavery. I know that that's not the truth. And I'm very thankful to have parents that taught me that wasn't the truth. But imagine being a Black student or an Indigenous student or just any student of color, learning that your history begins with a marginalized process and something that was meant to enslave you. That's a problem. And then also just instructional practices that we do within our individual spaces. So this is the setup. What we're about to do is we're about to go into the traits. So these, again, they're from the Dismantling Racism workbook. Cannot recommend enough. If you're interested in beginning on this journey, or you're just, what I'm saying is resonating with you, really, really, really recommend that you look into this. But what they do, so we've already identified culture through that framework. We've identified white supremacy culture through that framework. What they did was they identified 15 characteristics of white supremacy culture. And that's what we're going to talk about right now. These are the 15. I'm not going to go over all of them because we're all adults and we all can read. But there are a couple that I would like to touch on specifically with respect to STEM that I think definitely invade the space and really make it hard for all of us really to succeed. So before I started working at my new place, I was at a private school where a majority of the students were white. I would say about like 99%. And even then, these aspects of the culture rocked them to their core because they felt like they weren't good enough. And that's in STEM, but it's also in the world that we live in. I'd like to touch on perfectionism in STEM particularly. There's definitely a sense that in STEM, math and science especially, that you have to be perfect, that it's an A. And if it's not an A, it has to be an A+. And if it's an A-, why isn't it an A? And if it's an A, then why isn't it an A+, right? Like everything has to be perfect. And if you don't get it perfect the first time, then perhaps this subject is not for you. So growing up, I never got the message that math wasn't for me or that science wasn't for me. But I definitely saw that with my classmates where they felt as though if they got one question wrong on a math test, or maybe they got, like a D on something. If they wanted to be a doctor or if they wanted to be an engineer or if they wanted to work in a lab, suddenly that's not for them because the focus was on the mistake and they internalized themselves being the mistake instead of what was happening, which was this is an opportunity for growth. So that's absolutely an issue. We're going to talk a little bit about worship of the written word. That's the 5th one down on the left column. In STEM, if it is not written down, then it doesn't exist. I think of lab reports, right? I think of math tests. I think of all of these things that we do in STEM that specifically are addressing the fact that it needs to be written down. For me as a former math educator and also as a coach, I look for ways to mix it up a little bit. If a student can tell me why or how they solved a problem the way that they did, why is it any different from them physically writing it down? To me, that makes just as much sense. But for a lot of folks that are very entrenched in STEM fields, it has to be in a lab report, or it has to be on a test, or it has to be on a quiz. Otherwise, it does not exist. And that's problematic. If we're also talking about only one right way, I mean, I'm going to raise my hand. How many times in school have you been taught that this is the way that math is done? This is the way that you do this experiment. This is the way that you conduct this thing. And if you don't do it this way, then your points are going to get dinged, right? Or your grade is going to be impacted. Even at the binary level, I remember being in sophomore year biology and we had to have our textbooks covered in like a book sleeve. I used a brown paper bag and my points got dinged because even though my textbook was covered, it wasn't covered the way that they wanted it to be. that kind of superimposes itself into a lot of stuff in STEM. And also for students that are looking for innovative ways to solve stuff, it becomes really hard because if one right way is highlighted, you feel like you always have to do that one right way. Let's talk a little bit about either or thinking. Even as an adult myself, I have friends that are in STEM and I'm in STEM myself, and they feel like because they're in the STEM field, they don't have to care about politics. They don't have to care about history. They don't have to care about ELA or English. They don't have to care about it because they work in big tech or, maybe they're data analysts. They feel like because they're in this box right here, they don't have to do the other box over here. And that's as adults. The way that either or thinking manifests itself in the STEM field is that it's either right or it's wrong, and there's no in between. That kind of manifests itself too in the only right way. If you don't do that right way getting there, then it's very hard to figure out where somebody stands. And then I also want to talk a little bit, and this is the last one, I promise, on power hoarding, because as educators, there's already an inherent power imbalance is what I call it between the teacher and the student, right? As an adult, as the teacher, and also as the STEM coach, I hold a certain amount of power that if I were a student or if I were a teacher, I wouldn't have. I try to level it as much as I can just by methods that I use and instructional practices that I use. But at the end of the day, I'm seen as an instructional leader and as a teacher, whereas the students are students. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but let's make sure that we're not unhealthily policing. Let's make sure that we're understanding where our students are coming from. And let's make sure that it's misunderstanding instead of misbehavior. So I'm going to take a break since I just did a lot. And if you have any questions in the chat that you'd like for me to either address or, I don't know, if you just want to ask a question, I'm totally here for that before we get into the nitty gritty of why this is bad, besides all the other stuff, and then how to make sure that we can address this in our classrooms.
Well, I definitely think as I reflect on some of these very prompts, I have both personal connections as well as things that I've seen in my students. So I have the honor of leading the Orange County Robotics Consortium. Our goal is to work with students grades 3 through 8 and support them in having access to computer science and STEM and engineering opportunities through robotic competitions. And so often, one of the things that I think is a challenge for some of the girls anyway, has definitely been a consideration that that's for the boys, that that's not for us. And then I definitely think when it comes to looking at some of the programming aspects, getting into some of the autonomous spaces, I definitely have found a seeming hesitance, maybe because of some of the math that's required with that. But then on the perfectionism side, I definitely think growing up, just the idea that, if you are Black in a space, you have to go above and beyond, and you have to be even better than. And even when you're doing your best, you have to do even better than that. And it's quite exhausting. But I definitely think when I read that, I said, gee, that's pretty interesting how that permeates spaces and even permeates what you think as it relates to your pathway you have to take to get to your goals.
Yeah, I even think so. So these characteristics are pervasive throughout every department, every discipline, everything. I even think of my wife, Courtney, and I've mentioned that she's in the Air Force. She sees every single one of these every single day, like fear of open conflict. She personally is not afraid to go to her commander if she sees an injustice, but there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes where there are folks that don't feel comfortable going because they don't want to open up a can of worms. The same with bigger is better, more, or progress is bigger, better, more, whatever we want to call it. That has groundings in where we are is not okay. In order for us to make progress, we have to do more, we have to be bigger, we have to be better. I mean, that's a lot of the missions she's been on. That's just a lot of the things that she encounters in her just day-to-day meetings. Same with power hoarding, right? Like you've got commanders, you've got sergeants, you've got captains. So she sees a lot of this in her specific work and rightfully calls it out. She's also about to transition out, so I think she just doesn't care. And she's like, I'm just going to call it out whenever I see it. But it is interesting how it really pervades itself through every single facet, of what we do. And yeah. So speaking of that, let's talk a little bit about how this relates to STEM. And I have talked about this and touched on it a little bit, but I think it's really important to call it out when we see it. So I'm going to lay it plain. I'm going to call a spade, and we're going to get nitty gritty as to why this is damaging, not just in K-12, but afterwards. So let's have fun. So specifically, I'm going to talk a little bit about scientists and science labs first. So this was an article that was released by Cell Press specifically. They are a group of scientists and just science researchers that periodically will release articles. They released this, and the name is Science Has a Racism Problem. Specifically, they were calling out, they were 13 scientists, and what they were doing was they said, we are 13 scientists, we are not Black, underrepresentation is ridiculous, science has a racism problem. They called it out. Let's go even further. They talked about how the history of human genetics has been used repeatedly for scientific rationale for the definition of human races. They put that in quotations because race is a social construct to support inequality. I mean, like, boom, they called it out. They also talk about the exploitation of Black research subjects, which could be an entirely different conversation, but specifically Black and brown folks have been used as testing subjects on medical, at like experiments and projects and things like that, and that produces inaccurate information. They also talk about actionable next steps to highlight and increase representation of Black scientists. So this is them specifically taking a stand. They are saying, this is bad, we don't want it anymore, here's what we're gonna do instead. Now, although this is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful first step, right? The fact that this even has to be said is curious. And I think that it highlights a problem that is systemic within STEM, where folks are gatekept, opportunities are not given. Maybe depending school to school, teacher to teacher, offerings are different. And we want to make sure that as teachers, even if we don't teach STEM, that we can provide the best opportunities for our students. So I don't want to see science has a racism problem anymore. What I want to see is science is inclusive, right? Science is welcoming, and that all of our prospective applicants have a fair shot. The next thing, so Microsoft, not too long ago, released that they were going to increase their Black senior leadership by 2025. So I'm looking at the imaginary watch on my hand, and it is 2020, okay? My first reaction when I saw this was, why is it going to take 5 more years, right? So why is it going to take from 2020 to 2025 to increase Black senior leadership? That's a question that goes through my mind. And for full disclosure, I have consulted for Microsoft in the past. I work with them tangentially now. So this is an issue that's very near and dear to my heart as a Black consultant, because I don't see enough people that look like me. What I do see, though, and what has happened to me, are white subject matter experts in education in the EdTech marketing department that have never been teachers. They've never been teachers. They've never been principals. They've never even been in a school since they graduated high school or college. So then my credentials get called into question as a Black woman by a white person that has never been in education and has never taught a class. To me, that's problematic. So I see this statement, and to give a brief debrief, they're talking about addressing racial injustice and inequity, talking about increasing Black senior leadership, talking about engaging their ecosystem, talking about strengthening the diversity community. When I consult for companies and when I see things like this, one of the things I specifically look for is it going to be a safe space for me? I'm learning that some spaces are not as safe as I thought. If my credentials as an educator and a subject matter expert are being called into question, this is problematic by folks that have never worked in the field. And I think that all as educators, we share that sentiment where we are just done. right? We are absolutely done with people that don't understand us. They don't understand our profession, and they're marketing to us, or, you know, they want our help and it's unpaid, or, you know, blah, blah, blah. I'm just done. What I want, instead of empty platitudes about increasing senior leadership, because that's it. It's just the recruitment. It's not the retention. I want to hear about retention. I want to know what you're going to do to make sure that I and other Black leadership are going to be safe and supported and uplifted in tech spaces. Because y'all want to talk a big game about recruitment, but you don't do anything for retention. And that is concerning to me. And when I coach new students, and in my new role as a STEM coach, this is something that we, you know, reveal to them as the reality. If you're a person of color in tech, you're going to encounter these types of boundaries. We're going to call a spade, and I'm not a fan of lying to kids. So I absolutely bring that up whenever I can. Last but not least, as a math educator, former math educator, but current math researcher, and I just love math. I'm a total math nerd. This was a huge article that, you know, compounded across the Atlantic, and I can actually link this as well if you are interested. But this was about how math has a race problem, and specifically, what it talks about is how if you point out gaps, like racial gaps in math education, what you're doing is you're saying that students of color cannot rise to the occasion to do what they're supposed to do, which is the math. So math education in particular has been really centered on the persistent underperformance of student groups. We're talking about Black, Latinx, Indigenous youth, but we also have to consider the disparate access between like honors, gifted, advanced. We also have to think about the fact that we need accessible math pathways for students. If a student doesn't want to advance beyond geometry or algebra 2, this should not be something that they are shamed for. You know, if a student doesn't want to take calculus, this should not be something that they're shamed for. Colleges and universities have kind of created this weird rat race where if you're not in AP Calc, by the time you're a senior, then you're a failure. And that's not the narrative that we want to promote. We want to promote that every student is doing the best they can for a pathway that is appropriate for them. So I just clicked and it didn't work, so we're going to try again. There we go. So how can we make STEM curriculum culturally responsible and responsive and accessible? Because that's what it's all about. So here are my big four. The first is that academic success and cultural relevance need to work together. And I'm actually going to show you a snippet of curriculum that I've created that highlights this. But these things don't need to operate in a vacuum. They can totally operate alongside each other. Second, we need to dive deep into STEM discoveries, findings, and achievements in non-Eurocentric cultures. Whenever I give projects, or maybe I'm showing examples, like let's just not focus on the United States or Europe. Let's talk about buildings in Africa. You know, let's talk about buildings in Taiwan. Let's talk about Taipei 101. One of the largest structures in Taiwan, right? That's not Eurocentric, and it purposely brings that cultural element to your classroom. That way they're thinking outside of the box. Personal opinion, we see enough of America in America, right? I want my students to think outside the box and see outside of their country. So this is a very easy, intentional way for you to do this with everything that you do. Also, integrating what we call collectivist thought into your instructions, activities, and assessments. Collectivist thought means that we're all working together towards a collaborative shared goal. Individualist thought is that bootstraps, right? Like I got mine, I'm working by myself. When we work together, our strengths are greater than our weaknesses. If we're working by ourselves, and I'm not saying that working by ourselves doesn't have merit, but I'm finding that when with STEM especially, hearing other perspectives, working with other people, really collaborating, not only does that build those soft skills, but it gives students a chance to, you know, really leverage all of their qualities and uniquenesses in our spaces. And then also giving opportunities for student choice and agency is also good because that brings that authentic learning. And I'll also show you what that looks like soon. So let's check it out. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing this. And we're gonna hop to our first example. And it's right here. Okay. I'll just leave it here, that way y'all can see, but I will go ahead and make it just a little bit bigger. There we go. So I talked a little bit just about how cultural relevancy can work alongside academic content, and that these two things do not need to operate in a vacuum. When I was at my last institution and now at my new one, so I technically don't work for a school district. I work for a company called Technology Access Foundation, which as a STEM coach, I partner with schools. So I am a instructional coach at a school site, but they also have a district person. But when I was working on this at my last school, and even now when I talk about how these things can work alongside each other, in my last school, we were working on a probability and statistics curriculum. And I wanted to bring in current events because it just made sense. Like prob and stat is the perfect opportunity to talk about these types of things. And of course, they didn't believe me. So I decided I'm just going to do it myself. So I created a curriculum, and this is a snippet of it, on probability and statistics through the lens of racial justice. Now, if we look at the course abstract, it provides an introduction to prob and stat through the lens of race, racial justice, African American studies, and equity. What a perfect opportunity, right? Because we hear about the stats, we hear about crime, we hear about the housing market, we hear about all this stuff. What better opportunity to do this than have it alongside the content? To me, it just made sense. So the topics itself specifically refer to math. We've got the probability models, we've got the data, we've got statistics, but notice how the racial justice is always woven in through there. We've got our units, we've got our course skills, we've got our course content. So I wanted them to not only be familiar with the basic rules of probability, but also be able to use them in modeling uncertainty and obtaining and recording data with regard to race, racial equity, and justice. So the math is the forefront, the racial justice is alongside of it. You'll notice that if we take a look at our text down here, only one really is just content-based. All the other supplementary texts are based on just how algorithms and data and probability and statistics can be used, unfortunately, to manipulate and unfortunately superimpose themselves onto the lives of marginalized communities. Also, shout out to Algorithms of Oppression, great book. If you're interested, you should totally read it. All right, so for the scope and sequence, again, when I crafted this with my institution, right, for my essential questions, math focus, but along the lines of racial justice. What is race? How can we facilitate and lead conversations about race in the math classroom? What is data? So they're math focused through the lens of racial justice. Now, this was a high school math course. But even if you're elementary, if you're middle grades, right, if you have some sort of unit or anything where you're talking about statistics and talking about how this plays out, there are just a lot of really cool opportunities and spaces for you to use this. And again, just another, plug that this can work alongside each other. The racial justice and the culturally responsive element doesn't need to happen in a vacuum. It can happen alongside all of the academic content that you have. So that is that. All right, now we're gonna move on to some more stuff. So again, full disclosure, former math educator, most of this is going to be math related, but I wholeheartedly believe that all of this can be superimposed onto whatever content that you have. So this was one that I did with my Algebra 2 class last year, and this was properties of real numbers. For those of you that are noticing the pair in the bottom left, that is a pair from Pear Deck, and I'm a huge Pear Deck fan myself, so I do tend to use that quite frequently. But I noticed that in my last school, even though my students were juniors, they didn't really have a lot of the basics from the Algebra 1 foundation, or even the pre-algebra foundation. And truth be told, that was a little tough because we're entering Algebra 2 and I expect them to have this prior knowledge and they don't. Now, my job as a STEM educator isn't to say, what's wrong with you, right? I don't know why you don't know properties of real numbers. My job as a STEM educator is saying, how can I get you where you need to be? So we did a pair deck together on properties of real numbers. You'll notice how we're entering not with assumed information, right? And that kind of goes back to culture. I'm trying to build culture by figuring out where my students are. So instead of assuming that they know what a real number was, I'm trying to figure out where they are. So what do we know about real numbers? Draw or type 2 examples of real numbers. And then we get into the content. So I talk about the different properties, right? We talk about distributive, we talk about associative. I have checks for understanding all along the way. And again, that goes with building culture. I'm not assuming that they know that addition distributes over multiplication. And actually it's the opposite. But what I am assuming is just making sure that they are with me 100%. So adding those checks for understanding decolonizes that assumption that they know what's going on. Same here. I had a lot of students, even at the junior level, that struggled with the number line. Like, this was challenging for them. Additive identity was something that was also challenging for them. So I wanted to add checks for understanding, that way they knew what was going on. What's really cool about Pear Deck as a tool as well is that, we talked about collectivist versus individualist. Pear Deck is done individually, but the responses are shown as a whole class. So collectively, right, collectivist thought, we can review the responses, we can go over what we said. Another plus is that it's all anonymous. So if a student is wrong, it doesn't necessarily have their name attached to it. They can be wrong and they can be open and honest and authentic about it. Another cool thing is that we, with the checks along the way, wanted to make sure that we could build community and have that collectivist thought and create problems ourselves. And what I did was I would use these problems for our warm up the next day. So that is what I did for properties of real numbers. And that was a super cool lesson. They loved it. Another thing that I found that we were having difficulty with was relations and functions. So again, as a teacher, it's not my job to say, how are you in Algebra 2 and you don't know what a function is. My job is to say, how can I get you to where you need to be? That's my job. So we did a whole couple of days on relations and functions. We did a Venn diagram, again, via Pear Deck, if you can catch that little pair in the bottom left, just talking about what they were, right? What did we know? And again, that's collectivist thought. Nothing is assumed. We are building community. We are building relationships. After that, we go into detail, right? How do we display relations? How do we display functions? On top of that, checks for understanding. Draw an example of a relation. Show me what that looks like. That way, if you're not there, we can go back. Correcting the sentence, which is something I do in STEM a lot. And I feel like my students are like feeling some type of way about it because they see the sentences for the most part in ELA class or maybe social studies. But I do a lot of this in STEM as a community builder and also as something for collectivist thought, because I want them to know that sentences and ELA and humanities are just as important in STEM as they are in their respective disciplines. And again, that's that collectivist thought. Everything is working together instead of that either or thinking of everything working separately. We talk a little bit more, we talk about function notation, but at the end of the day, I wanted to make sure that they were not only okay, but supported with making sure they knew what these things were. And last but not least, this was my favorite one. So I taught a class on gender and racial bias in mathematics, specifically within STEM, but with a focus on math, because again, I was a former math educator. And again, we did use Pear Deck, big Pear Deck fan. But we started just by figuring out, again, collectivist thought. Why might bias exist in STEM? So we talked about their specific point of view and then perhaps another point of view. We talked about big questions. And these are the three that I typically use when I'm talking about debunking STEM with kids. Who is telling the story? Why is the story being told? And then how do we want the story to be remembered? right? These are all things that we think about, not even in STEM, but more so in the STEM field, because when I was growing up, and for a lot of my students, they only learn about white men. They don't learn about women, and they don't learn about people of color. And one of the projects that I do with them is I give them a list of known scientists. Most of them are white men, some of them are white women. And I say, okay, do you know these folks? And for the most part, they say yes. And I say, okay, we're going to do research, and we're going to do like almost like a book project or history project on a scientist or on a STEMinist, as I call it. But you cannot pick them from this list. They freak out. They are having a tough time because they are conditioned to believe that these are the only ones that are known. But then after spending time researching and looking and digging, they find so many people of color, so many women, so many marginalized people that were really pioneers in the field. So that's a really empowering project for them. Specifically, we talk about the Pythagorean theorem. We talk about how Pythagoras, although he is a great mathematician, he actually learned the Pythagorean theorem from what he calls his travels in Nubia. Nubia is Africa. So we accredit the theorem to him when really he is not the originator of the theorem. We talk a little bit just about historical background and context of the myth of racial hierarchy and mathematical ability, specifically pyramids of Giza, right? It's a very well-known myth that the aliens built the pyramids. I put myth in quotation marks and also aliens in quotation marks because, I mean, we know that people did it. This stems from racial hierarchy that Black and brown folks, they're in no way capable, right? They're in no way smart enough to build the pyramids. And that has been documented. So, I mean, folks can believe what they want to believe, but it is on record that pyramids of Giza have been built by people. So we do talk about that and how that plays into race and mathematical hierarchy. We also talk about the myth of gender hierarchy and mathematical ability. Hidden Figures, although I think is a great gateway, I mean, it's a motion picture. So there's a lot behind the scenes, and we talk about that. We also talk about just several women that are in the STEM field and math in particular, that were really trailblazers in these fields. We want to honor them and we want to recognize them. And then we end, I did a math memoir with my students last year where we just think, right? We get critical. What challenged you? What inspires you? What sits well with your soul? What doesn't sit well with your soul? What's one challenge or learning or growth opportunity? And then just reflecting on that thinking. So instead of it being just, okay, I'm power hoarding, I'm like in my desk, I'm just learning, we share out, we learn from each other. And that's really what all of this is about. In order for STEM to be that culturally responsive space, and I'll stop sharing, we've got to learn from each other. And we've also got to make sure that we're holding each other accountable. So that is what I had. Thank you for listening. And I'll be, I guess, in the chat box hanging out. And wow. I can also share links.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. I am so inspired. I just feel that there's been an emergence as of recent with the, conversation around culture and culturally responsive strategies to integrate into your pedagogy. So I think it's really, really fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I would agree that there's definitely been like a resurgence of that, or an insurgence, whatever we want to call it. I want to make sure, of course, that folks have the right materials because there's so much online and some of it has positive intent, but can be unintentionally damaging to students.
Sure.
Whenever I create materials, I always, lead with that. I make sure that all folks are supported, that everything. I want to make sure that we lay it plain and that we understand what's going on.
Well, I definitely would like to share one experience I've had that I still don't know how to process. I have an interesting in that I work in Orange County for the Orange County Department of Education. And, where I work, it's been a great opportunity for me to be of service to, believe it or not, 28 districts, about 500,000 students. Ironically, though, where I work, I happen to be the only African-American in the space. And in many cases, I'm the only male in the space. And it's always been quite fascinating for me. And recently, a group of colleagues of mine have taken on several books that they want to read. One of them happened to be White Fragility. And I
Yeah.
had I had a coworker call me and say, "Hey Omar, I just want you to know, if I've ever been unintentionally racist, I want you to know I apologize, and I want you to know I want you to feel comfortable in coming to tell me about it." And I'm still flabbergasted by that because I've never had anyone come to me to share that type of reflection or point of thought, and I thought it was quite interesting. I'll
Yeah,
share.
absolutely. So I was in a similar situation in my last institution. I was the only Black faculty
Oh wow.
ever, and also for a very long time. And there were times, when folks were maybe like, if something happens, like let me know, So for me, I kind of took that as like, okay, thank you for being self-aware.
Sure.
But then I would also healthily push back and say, okay, the fact that you're aware is a wonderful, wonderful place to start. But
Right.
like, if you don't want to have a micro or macro aggression,
Hmm.
here are some resources, or here's some work that you can
Well,
do. Just yeah,
I definitely think there are some subtleties that are just amongst everyday interactions. Now, I know they're framed in those, really, I'll call them containers of micro and macro aggressions,
absolutely.
but I'll share they're so nuanced that they're almost unobservable unless you're really keen on what's happening in the
Yes.
moment, In fact, one experience I had working with, students where uh, a school only had about 5 African Americans at the school, and some of the other students were referring to the students as Hershey's. And I tried to interpret it in a very positive context and try to support by saying, hey, maybe these folks haven't had much exposure to others that are of different hue and pigment, and trying to invoke a positive spin, but in reality, looking at the challenge of that situation and how to navigate that. I think sometimes as an educator, um, and looking at what policies and protocols are in place at your school site, it can be a slippery slope in how you navigate some of those
Yeah,
things.
absolutely. I agree. We want to make sure, again, like leading with positive intent.
Hmm.
But then that next hurdle is making sure that nobody is unintentionally harmed.
Right, right.
Mhm.
Well, I know we do have until 3:40. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and stop the recording now. That way
Okay.
it'll be a good time to wrap it up. And I'd like to formally thank you again for leading us through this session, and
Yeah.
everyone else for joining us as we come together for Edcamp here at
Yeah.
OCQ and LAQ. I want to
Yeah.
stop
I
the
want to go ahead and give a